There are some really odd moments. I mean, it's quite an odd film, actually, in many ways. We're talking about Starve Acre. Paul is here. This is a British folk horror. This stars Matt Smith from House of the Dragon, Last Night in Soho, Doctor Who. I guess that's what he's most famous for, maybe TV-wise. Morfydd Clark, who was brilliant in St. Maud. You still haven't seen that, Paul. You've got to get on it.
I know, I'm bad horror fan.
Bad horror gay. Yeah. We've got a supporting cast that includes Erin Richards, Robert Ems, Sean Gilder, and Arthur Shaw. So this is based on the award-winning 2019 novel, which was Starve Acre, also the same title, by Andrew Michael Hurley. And there is original music by Matthew Herbert. We were talking about him because coming out, I recognised the name. I couldn't remember where I'd seen him, but he's done a lot of remixes for like Maloko and Björk. He's quite a, established soundtrack composer. Yeah. So let's talk about the story. It's set in the 70s. We like a 70s folk horror. Obviously, there are going to be comparisons. I suppose the 70s were a good time for folk horrors, particularly British horrors. This is set in rural Yorkshire. So, the landscape is quite effective. I mean, it's quite a good setting for a horror. Richard and Juliette, their seemingly idyllic family life is thrown into turmoil. Their young son, Owen, starts acting out of character. It's quite a grisly start to the film, actually, when you think about it. Because, we don't like animal cruelty. I'm not saying that's displayed on screen. It's obviously there are conditions for animals being used in films. But, it's quite a nasty intro.
Yeah. I guess that sets the tone for what's to come.
Yeah, it does. It does it quite well. So it's a sudden tragic event bringing grief and driving a wedge between the once happy couple. And I suppose that's quite a difficulty in itself because Morfydd Clark showed a range of emotions in St. Maud. In this, she's pretty much depressed all the way through, and it does kind of rub off on you, I think, that mood of sadness and trauma and grief. Obviously it's there for a reason. It's meant to make you feel uncomfortable.
Tonally it works really well, and especially with the kind of landscape and also the 70s-ness means it's all kind of, all the clothes are kind of beiges and browns, and the landscape is dark and a bit gloomy, and it's very atmospheric in that, but it's not very cheerful.
The story itself is set in this remote family home. He's an archaeologist, isn't he? He's burying himself in his work, and that's another thing, that's another trope that we've seen in horror films before. I kept thinking of the Amityville Horror, although it's a very different story. There are similarities where someone who you love or once loved is becoming this crazy character, and he does bury himself in that work, and quite literally, I suppose. And he's kind of exploring this folklore myth as well, and discovers this root of this tree.
And it's that kind of obsessive throwing yourself into something as a response to something else that's happened, which never really ends well, does it?
No. And I suppose she does, again, go back to the tropes. Juliette turns to the local community for help to help her find peace, because she's obviously going through trauma, not just with the troubles she's having in the relationship, but also what's happened in the past, without wanting to spoil anything. There's a couple and this woman comes to see her, and she's trying to help her breathe, and it's all kind of meditative, but it's very
witchy.
Ominous. Very witchy. Were you scared by it? Unnerved?
I was definitely unnerved as it went later on. It was unnerving, and I worried about quite a few of the characters in it. I thought they were at peril. Really built the tone very ominously, and I think what was clever about it was, as the two lead characters both share this big trauma that happens. They deal with it in different ways, but actually both ways kind of lead them to the big denouement of the film, and it kind of works, which is really clever plotting, I think, in that it's not, some of these things you think, one character becomes obsessive and then the other one becomes a victim of them, and actually they don't agree on certain things, and they approach their suffering in different ways, but then kind of adhere to the same thing at the end.
I suppose you have got the threat of that satanic feel, the myth, the folklore thing, which is quite a creepy thing in itself. But I think what this film does, it taps into relationships falling apart as well, which can be a horrifying thing in itself, I think. If you think you've known somebody, especially if you're married to someone, I suppose if you see somebody's personality changing, that itself can add to that fear. Yeah,
and especially when they're in a very isolated setting, and again, a little bit of a trope, but they're kind of in the place that's his where he grew up, but they have previously lived in the big city together, and then they've moved back here to kind of start a new life, and it is very isolating. So just on the doorstep there's this huge ominous landscape, and at times that feels very threatening. I think the music and the atmosphere really adds to that.
And I suppose you got that fear of neighbours not being who you thought they were. You've got Sean Gilder, who plays the quite beefy neighbour, who's Gordon. He was in Slow Horses recently, really good in that, and he's been in Shameless. He's been in loads of TV things. Yeah. He's really good because I think he's one of those actors that you really feel him when on screen. You feel his presence.
Yeah. Is he Irish in real life? Or maybe that's just the role he played in Shameless. But Teen Malone played his wife.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So let's talk about the effects then in this, because there are some really odd moments. I mean, it's quite an odd film actually in many ways, but there's some odd moments involving the bones of a hare. Without spoiling anything, Richard finds these bones and puts them in a box, and it's quite interesting what happens from there on. At first I thought that this camera trickery was, it's a mixture, isn't it, of camera trickery and like puppetry, and I thought it was really cleverly done. But at first I kind of laughed because I thought, oh my god, this is quite nuts, in a way that I think if a lot of other people had done it, it might not have worked so well. But I think actually what happens is it does add to the creepiness of the film. Yeah,
definitely. It kind of looks realistic as to what's happening, and there's some of it that's a bit visceral and quite grim, and there's, bits where I looked away and was like, that's just horrid. I think maybe it over-explains itself a little bit at the end. One element in particular to do with the bones of the hare or the rabbit and what becomes of it is kind of very on the nose, even if it's a little twitchy, rabbity nose at the end.
Yeah. You haven't seen Lamb, have you, with Noomi Rapace? It made me think of that film. I don't think it's as good as Lamb, but it definitely had an unsettling quality, and I think that added to it. But like I say, if it had been done by somebody else who didn't really have the expertise of how to incorporate that into quite a serious film, I think it could have been very novelty and very naff. But I don't think it was. I think it was definitely quite trippy.
I think if you think of the way a film like The Witch kind of handles stuff going on, and it's that stuff where it's like weird stuff, and it's almost become a trope that it ends up being the character's imagination, or they're hallucinating, or they're not who they, and actually then some stuff that looks very odd turns out to be real, and then you just have to kind of go with it. And I think that they did that in quite a convincing way. It isn't silly when it could be. Like I imagine what happens, and if you'd see it on paper and on the script, it might look a bit like, oh god, that's going to be hard to do seriously, but actually they do very well. And I think a big part of that is the actors as well. They're very restrained in their performances, which I think helps.
Yeah, because Morfydd Clark, going back to, Matt Smith I've always enjoyed, but I don't really know much about him. I've not really seen that much stuff that he's been in. I saw Last Night in Soho, thought that was okay. And Doctor Who, I'm not a Doctor Who fan, my other half is, but yeah, I don't really know much about him. I thought his performance was good. I thought Morfydd Clark was really good, but I don't know if they had enough really to work on. It's like I say, with that kind of mood, it was quite ominous and downbeat from the start. So I think there's only so much you can do with that.
They didn't get too much light before they had their shade.
No, I know, and I kind of wanted that, because I think you need a little bit of that balance. Otherwise, it's just a bit exhausting. And I think it was quite a tiring experience to watch it. But I'm not saying that was a bad thing. I think it definitely was a moody piece. Yeah. Were you pleased with the outcome?
Yeah, it made sense and wrapped itself up. I thought it was a bold and decent ending, and it was kind of consistent with what they'd been teasing us with as the film went on. They could have maybe even gone a bit bolder with it, but
I was going to say that because like you say, the end was bold. I mean, the end was grim. But the rest of it was more about atmosphere, I think, and about this premise, this kind of build up of things not being right. But I think we only saw that really come to fruition at the end, and I think maybe there could have been a bit more of that at the beginning, or maybe halfway in. But it was just all atmosphere, I think, which I think is fine. But I kind of wanted a bit more, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think this film, it's got stiff competition. It's been a fantastic year for horror this year. Already we've seen, Late Night with the Devil. We've seen The First Omen. There's been some really good horror films. Smile 2 is out later in the year. It's a really good year for horror. I'm not sure if this is up there, but I think it's okay. Yeah, I didn't dislike it.
I think for me it will. I think people who like things a little bit more subtle and slow burn will appreciate it. I kind of think, people who maybe like Ben Wheatley films, if you think about the In This Earth, the one that I mentioned before, where you've got all the stuff with the roots and the trees and nature and stuff like The Witch and some of the other subtle and slow build ones, I think people will quite enjoy that. But I do think some of these films, the challenge they have is that the sort of drama is good, the sort of like relationship drama and that interplay. People who like moody dramas would quite enjoy it, but then it does then become full-on horror by the end, and that would be off-putting some of those people. So I think you're pitching it as a sort of subgroup of horror fans, as in horror fans who are happy to watch some stuff that's a bit slower, more slow and building up, to get your kind of horror reward at the end, rather than it be out and out horror throughout.
Yeah, I think you're right. Should we go for a star rating?
4. Oh, I never know where the camera is. 4.
Oh wow, okay. I'm going for 3. It's a strong 3 though. I think if I was giving halves, it would probably be 3.5. But I'm going to go.
We should round up to 4.
It wasn't quite a 4. I don't think it's one of those films that I would necessarily want to see again, or if I was having a top 5 list of horror films of the year, it probably wouldn't be in there. Just because, like I say, it's got competition. I think there are loads of other good horrors that I think probably better.
For me, I think it's very well made and very atmospheric, and it in what it's trying to do, and I think it achieves that kind of giving you the sense of, because part of horror, isn't it? It's like, is it wanting to scare you or unsettle you? And we were having a chat when we saw the film the other week about films that we'd seen in the past couple of years that really unsettled us, and I kind of think it does that well in terms of what it's trying to achieve, and it just staves off the silliness at the end, because I think either films aren't engaging or serious enough or atmospheric enough, or they are and then become a bit silly, whereas this kind of just about manages. So yeah, I think I'm happy to give it 4 stars.
So it's in UK and Irish cinemas. It's called Starve Acre. It's out on the 6th of September. We're quite out front with that one, actually. If you like folk horror, check out the review that's on the screen. Don't forget, please subscribe and support the channel. Let us know if you're going to see it, if you have seen it, and we'll see you next time. I'll see you tonight, Paul, for In a Violent Nature.
Yes,
can't wait.
That'll be fun.